right, so what do we know now we didn't know last week? Well, we now know that 2012 was the safest year for air travel since the dawn of the jet age more than 50 years ago. In all of 2012, there were only 22 fatal crashes worldwide on all flights, and only 10 of those crashes were on passenger aircraft, according to data assembled by the Aviation Safety Network. These figures were compiled before last week's crash of a jet near Moscow, which killed 4 people. But before that crash, the data works out to about 1 fatal accident per 2.5 million flights. And keep in mind that 2012 was also twice as safe as the previous safest year on record, which was 2011. And not only was it twice as safe as the previous year, but the total number of flights increased by 5.5%, according to the International Civil Aviation Organization. We now know that in the U.S., which hasn't had a single fatal accident since a commuter plane crash in Buffalo in 2009, the picture is even more impressive. After 2 crashes in 1996 that killed a combined 375 people, a White House commission cracked down on the airline industry, asking them to reduce the rate of fatal accidents over a 10-year period. In 2007, the accident rate dropped to 65%. That's 1 fatal accident in about 4.5 million departures, from 1 in nearly 2 million in 1997, according to the New York Times. We know that back in the 1970s and 1980s, when plane crashes were routine, this kind of safety record would have been unthinkable. I mean, think for a second. We hurl hundreds of thousands of pounds of metal through the air at over 500 miles an hour, millions of times a day, and it almost never goes wrong. We know that in the wake of the spectacle of frustrating dysfunction that was the fiscal curb deal, it can be easy to get cynical about the possibility of progress. We know it really is possible for us as a society, through regulation and technology and competition and boring, unheralded work of civil servants in the Federal Aviation Authority and National Transportation Safety Board, to solve extremely difficult, deadly problems. We still don't know what the Obama administration's legal justification for targeted killing of combatants, including American citizens, abroad is, because they claim those internal legal justifications are secret. We now know that U.S. District Judge Colleen McMahon agrees with the White House. New York Times and 2 of its reporters, Charlie Savage and Scott Shane, sued the government for internal documents relating to the U.S. drone strikes that killed American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman, in separate strikes in 2011. The Times explicitly requested to see a memorandum about the legality of such strikes prepared by the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, despite noting that disclosure of the administration's secret justification for killing American citizens might help us better understand the, quote, vast and seemingly ever-growing exercise in which we have been engaged for well over a decade. Judge McMahon nevertheless ruled the government did not violate the Freedom of Information Act in refusing to turn over the documents. We know the New York Times will appeal, and we know we cannot even have the most basic democratic debate about the propriety or constitutionality of targeted killing of American citizens unless we know just what legal arguments the White House is making in its favor. Back at the table now, Susie Kim of the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnson, Veronique Derugy of George Mason University. Oliver Stone still with us. I want to find out what you now know. Susie Kim.
All right, so what I know now after this week is that President Obama and the last Congress did their darndest to preserve George W. Bush's legacy. And why do I say that? That's because the fiscal cliff deal only raised income taxes on 0.7% of all taxpayers. That's just because there aren't that many Americans who earn more than $450,000, who have estates worth more than $5 million. And why did they do this? What we know is that they did this in the name of protecting the middle class. But as you saw over the course of the debate, the definition of who got defined as middle class got defined up higher and higher. So as a result, you know, there are some parts of the fiscal cliff deal that did help the working poor, that helped the unemployed, but those changes were temporary. What happened is that the fiscal cliff deal preserved the vast majority of Bush tax cuts. Those are now permanent, and that's going to be a cornerstone of Obama's own legacy, is protecting the tax changes that his predecessor, George Bush, passed.
David K. Johnson.
Well, what I know is reinforced by what you're just point about airlines. The government cracked down and we got safer airlines. I talked to businessmen, 2 of them this week when I was in New Orleans at the American Association of Law Schools, and who both said to me that they hate this pressure to lower wages on their workers. They want universal health care. They can't do it because the system won't let them do it. The rules matter. And one of the panels that we talked about there was about how when government allows some businesses to cheat, it isn't just the consumers they're cheating, it's every honest business. Same thing applies to safety rules. Rules matter. Rules define our society, and if you don't have rules that say everybody has to play and enforce those rules, you end up with terrible problems. We would have plane crashes left and right if it weren't for consistent rules on safety.
Veronique.
What we know is that the president is pursuing rendition policy, the kidnapping and interrogating of suspected terrorists without due process, policy that he criticized heavily, rightfully, when George Bush was doing it. So basically we know that not only is President Obama pursuing the failed economic policy of the Bush administration, but also the foreign policy blunder.
Oliver Stone.
Yeah, just in reference to the judge, you mentioned there were two literary references in her dialogue. She mentioned Alice in Wonderland, and she mentioned Catch-22.
Yes.
Just thought of that when you said that. Good quote. She was literary. Chapter 10 is coming up on January 14th. That's our last of our 10-part series, and we did a lot of new work into the future on the Obama is a very efficient war president, and he's talked about cyberspace and cyberspace development, full spectrum dominance, but really we put a tremendous effort in space, and we refused to sign the United Nations Treaty. We're an outlier, Israel and us. We don't go along.
About not weaponizing space.
We have militarized space, weaponized it with drones, but all kind. Alfred McCoy, University of Wisconsin, talks about a three-tier system from about 250 miles up down to about 50 miles up. Right. Very dangerous. Electronic frontier, it can blind a foreign army, and we are in charge of it. And the Chinese are not stupid, and neither the Russians, but it's a dangerous...
One of the things that comes across in Untold History is two things that dominated American public imagination: the nuclear bomb in space, which has sort of disappeared, but are still there, right? We're still in space, and nuclear weapons are still a problem. My thanks to Susie Kim of the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnson, Veronique Desrougiers of George Mason University, and Oliver Stone, Academy Award-winning director. His Showtime series, The Untold History of the United States, airs Monday nights at 8 Eastern. Thanks for getting up. Thank you for joining us today for Up. Join us tomorrow, Sunday at 8. I'll have freshman Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, and NAACP President and CEO Ben Jealous. Coming up next is Melissa Harris Perry on today's MHP, Lieutenants, how Eric Cantor and Joe Biden emerged this week as the key Washington deal makers and breakers. Plus, the president says immigration reform is at the top of his to-do list right now. What will meaningful reform look like? That's Melissa Harris Perry coming up next. We'll see you right here tomorrow at 8. Thanks for getting up. Happy New Year.